Well, it's that time that we've all been waiting for. It's time for me to try to explain the history, or the family tree, I suppose, if you prefer, of the X-Men. There are years and years of history and thousands of comics at this point, spanning across multiple series and in some cases, multiple universes. So of course, I can't necessarily fit every little tiny detail in this video, but I am going to do my best to give you an overview of the general evolution of the X-Men from the 1960s to modern day. And trust me, I've seen some other content there on YouTube, and I'm trying to give you guys the most detailed that I can in the time that I have. We only have so much time, so without further ado, I'm your host Amanda, and this is me attempting to explain the entirety of the X-Men. Woo! To really understand this team, we have to go all the way back to their humble beginnings over at Marvel Comics. The team supposedly came to be thanks to a group you're quite familiar with. No, I'm not talking about Marvel, and no, I'm not talking about legendary duo Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. I'm talking about us, the fans. Well, I mean, not me specifically, as I was not alive back in 1963, but the fans who were around back then and reading comics had a need for more Marvel team books. There were many solo hero books out there, but fans wanted to see more team-ups. And so Stan Lee and Jack Kirby came up with the X-Men. Stan Lee had said before that the challenge with team books where new characters were introduced was explaining how they all got their powers, their origins. To simplify this, he had an idea of making the entire team a group of mutants, using that same blanketed reason to explain how they each got their powers. Pretty easy, you can just say, hey, they're mutants. The brilliance of this is that while on paper this sounds like an easy, even lazier approach to some, it actually worked. A huge part of the reason why the X-Men were so successful and why we love them even today is because of their mutant status. Initially, Stan wanted to give them a simple name, denoting this status, the mutants. But publisher Martin Goodman turned down the name idea, citing the fact that no one knew what a mutant was. Some even believed that the name, the Mutants, could still be used as a good alternative name for the group when they debut in the MCU, but we'll have to wait to find out about that. Instead, Lee decided to take inspiration for the team's name from their leader and mentor, Professor X, calling them simply the X-Men. In those early comics created by Kirby and Lee, Professor Charles Xavier, or Professor X, as he'd come to be more commonly known, created a school for young mutants, guided by a dream of peaceful coexistence with humankind. You see, the public was not a fan of mutants, and there were many evil mutants out there that gave mutant kind a bad rap. To combat this, Professor X decided to create a school for gifted youngsters in Westchester County, New York, bringing together a team of young mutants using his telepathic abilities and Cerebro, which we later learned was actually created by X and his future student Jean Grey. The initial team and group of students that started it all were Cyclops, Beast, Angel, Iceman, and of course, Jean Grey as Marvel Girl. During these early days, they were also sometimes joined by Mimic, who initially was introduced as a deadly villain that could adopt the abilities and powers of those around him, making him a formidable foe for the X-Men, as he could, mimic all of their powers. However, Mimic would soon after be reformed, and after losing and regaining his powers kind of multiple times, would also end up adopting the OG X-Men roster's power sets permanently. These were the early days of the X-Men, which also introduced one of their greatest enemies, who coincidentally would also throughout the years become somewhat reformed before becoming a full-on anti-hero, or even to some, a full-on hero in modern day comics, Magneto, the master of magnetism, and his also quite infamous Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who themselves would have many various different versions and rosters throughout the years. Eventually, the X-Men series was taken over by Roy Thomas, beginning with issue number 20. Throughout the continuation of the series, other writers would also help out, and we'd see characters like Havoc, Cyclops' heroically reluctant brother, who was also a mutant, and Polaris, who we later learned was the daughter of Magneto, having powers similar to him, introduced. This series would be ongoing until issue number 66, where it would come to a firm stop as sales dwindled somewhat. Up until issue 93 of the series, the X-Men title would only exist to sell reprints of older stories. So there's a period there where nothing new is really happening, it's just a lot of reprints. However, with Giant-Sized X-Men issue number 1, we'd see X-Men return in a big way, finally getting a new tale and ultimately a revival. Len Wein and Dave Cockrum were the creatives behind this first Giantsized, which would become a Marvel and X-Men staple. In fact, recently in 2020, we saw a new Giantsized X-Men series emerge in this similar vein. Each issue of that series focusing on a story tied to a different X-Men. In the first ever Giant-Size X-Men issue number 1 though, a whole new team of X-Men were introduced, featuring Colossus, Wolverine, Storm, Thunderbird, Banshee, Nightcrawler, and Sunfire. Oh, and Cyclops was also there. Although it should be noted, as I talk about the evolution of the roster, I likely won't mention all members every single time to avoid repetition. I'm also not going to mention every single roster because I could just do that in one video and that could be a whole video. Suffice it to say, there have been a lot of X-Men rosters that Scott Summers has been a part of as well. If he's not mentioned, he might still be on there. The difference between this team and the original X-Men team was that this team was a lot more grown up. The former youngsters had all grown up and this team reflected that, with all new members also being adults as opposed to teens. The Giant-Size roster was also unique in that each team member was radically different from the other, having a completely different background, power set, and in many cases even country of origin. This was probably the first roster to really reflect another trait many fans love about the X-Men today: diversity. In terms of the why behind this team, they were brought together to rescue the original X-Men from the deadly sentient mutant island known as Krakoa, currently actually an ally to the X-Men in modern day comics, but once a villain in their history. Technically wedged in between this rescue attempt and when the X-Men ended up in peril was another team initially led by Moira McTaggart, but outside of the canon in real-world comic history, this team wouldn't be retconned into existence until the early 2000s. It would serve to help introduce the youngest Summers brother, the quote-unquote mystery Summers bro, Vulcan. But back to the Giant-Sized team. They were successful in their rescue mission and afterwards were left to ask the question, now that all the X-Men were safe and sound, new and old, what are we going to do with 13 X-Men? Well, they wouldn't have to worry about this too much, as they weren't lucky number 13 for too long. Shortly afterwards, Sunfire left the team in a huff, Thunderbird died on a mission unfortunately, Iceman and Angel ultimately moved out of the X-Mansion, and Havoc and Polaris decided to go back to school. Jean Grey as well also left for a period, kind of returning to school, but her romantic connection to Scott Summers kept her mostly active on the team's roster. Jean would also eventually become the Phoenix, sending us down a path towards one of the most iconic X-Men stories, I would say, of all time, the Phoenix Saga. And of course the even more iconic follow-up story, the Dark Phoenix Saga. While the adult X-Men team continued on, there were newer mutants introduced and a second X-Men title was added to make room for them and their stories. This new young team of teen mutants had a book whose title reflected just what they were, the New Mutants, in a way calling back to the simplicity of the title Stan Lee had originally thought up. This era is often considered one of the best among fans, with creative team Chris Claremont and John Byrne often standing out as the main folks we think of when we reflect back on these iconic moments and stories. In addition to the Phoenix Saga, there was also Days of Future Past and God Loves, Man Kills. Many of the stories you've seen brought to life in film and animated series adaptations are actually taken from this time period in mutant and X-Men history. Another spin-off title was added at this time to showcase the tales of the original X-Men roster, the most classic of teams. However, because we already had an X-Men team and title, this book and the team within its pages would become known instead as X-Factor. At that time, X-Factor was the old roster returning to action, not yet a mutant detective agency. Despite being what most fans associate with that name now, that version of X-Factor actually wouldn't become known to us until the early 2000s, with X-Factor Investigations making its first appearance in Madrox issue number 1 in 2004, which led into the 2005 X-Factor series, which is technically volume 3 of that series. Even more books would be added to what seemed to be developing as somewhat of an X-Men line, I would say. Excalibur appeared as part of Marvel UK's collection of comics. This comic featured 3 X-Men, Nightcrawler, Kitty Pryde, and Rachel Summers, who teamed up on adventures with Marvel UK superheroes Brian Braddock's Captain Britain and Megan. By the time we got to the 80s, we had a completely new roster of X-Men who were featured in in the Uncanny X-Men title, which actually is considered to be a renamed portion of the X-Men Legacy series. This new roster featured Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, Rogue, Psylocke, Dazzler, Longshot, and Havoc, among others. Angel, Nightcrawler, Polaris, Banshee, and Kitty Pryde's Sprite were also present, as was Professor X. This era featured one of my favorite X-Men story epics, Inferno. While the 80s were a pretty magical time for X-Men stories, the party came crashing to a halt somewhat in issue number 251 of Uncanny X-Men, when the team split up! Of course, no cliffhanger here for us living in the retrospective future, as we know the X-Men would and did return. In issue number 254, a new team revealed themselves, coming together on Muir Island, nearby to Scotland. This roster was made up of both mutants and humans, featuring Banshee, Polaris, Forge, Dr. Moira McTaggart, Professor X's son, Legion, Nightcrawler's magical foster sister and also romantic love interest, Amanda Sefton, Brigadier Sandy Stewart, who belonged to the Weird Happenings organization, aka WHO, Tom Corsi, Sharon Friedlander, and very briefly, Sunder. This mutant team is often referred to as the Muir Island X-Men. We were also introduced to supporting characters like the Muir Island Morlocks, including Callisto and Healer, and the Freedom Force, which initially featured Destiny, Mystique, and Valerie Cooper, but would kind of become like an alternate Brotherhood roster, to be honest. The core X-Men team, however, would stay pretty much broken up until issue number 270, when all mutants were brought together once more in Extinction Agenda to fight against the cyborg Cameron Hodge. Possibly one of the most famed X-Men creative teams of all time, started to sort out the current state of the X-Men and their fractured rosters as we moved into the 90s. Jim Lee and Chris Claremont. In issue number 273, we got a story called appropriately, Too Many Mutants. Truer words were never spoken, which aimed to rectify all the confusion by finally giving us a new X-Men roster featuring Storm, Wolverine, Psylocke, Jubilee, Gambit, Forge, and Banshee. By 1991, we saw the many mutants coming together once more to take on the evil psionic mastermind known as the Shadow King during the Muir Island saga. After that battle, however, we were once more left with the remnants of three teams all kind of jumbled together. The Muir Island X-Men, the X-Men X-Men, and X-Factor. Once again, at the end of X-Factor issue number 70, we were left with the question, this time asked by Professor X, what am I going to do with 14 X-Men? No one looks pleased either about this issue on the page where this question is asked, perhaps because they are all upset that Professor X has maybe forgotten them, as he seems to have miscounted, but I assume this is just supposed to be a play on the 13 and we're just one-upping it, because there's definitely people that are not included in that count, including some who are not pictured here, and you know, Professor X himself. There were likely even more than 14 X-Men now gathered. The solution to this question finally came in the form of creating multiple actual X-Men teams. Not spin-offs, but instead two main rosters. This is where the much-loved original X-Men Gold and Blue rosters come in, and this love is in fact proven by sales, with Jim Lee and Chris Claremont's X-Men issue number 1 being known as the best-selling comic of all time. At the time of this recording, there have been a reported over 8 million copies sold, which is pretty wild. The blue team featured Cyclops as leader, with Gambit, Rogue, Beast, Psylocke, Wolverine, and Jubilee rounding out the team's ranks, and briefly featuring Revanche as well. The blue team featured more of the edgy and newer X-Men characters, and was written and drawn by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. Featured in the pages of the second volume of X-Men from 1991, starting of course with issue number 1, although they wouldn't actually be the blue team until like a few issues later, in terms of like them just being the mainstay. Think about issue 4. The gold team, on the other hand, featured Storm as leader, with members including Colossus, Angel's Archangel, Bishop, Jean, Forge, and Iceman. This team was depicted as the more seasoned and experienced one, showcasing more of the classic X-Men of the 60s and 70s. This team's stories were told in the pages of Uncanny X-Men, kicking off with issue number 281 of the series. I personally love this cover. The creative team involved included John Byrne, Jim Lee, and Wilchi Portacio. The costumes showcased with both teams, designed by Jim Lee, became pretty iconic and served to inspire their looks in the 90s X-Men animated series. To this day, they're still my favorite X-Men suits. The 90s was also the time that we were introduced to the mutant Black Ops team X-Force, who initially started out as kinda like time-traveling assassins made up of the former New Mutants team, who are now being led by big gun-toting time-traveling son of Madeline Pryor, Scott Summers, and sort of Jean Grey, Gray from the future, Cable. X-Factor would also continue as a government-funded team led by Havoc and Polaris, and despite the fact that the two mainstay teams were introduced to help simplify the murkiness created by having simply too many characters, the 90s is actually where it gets somehow even more confusing. Despite each team being somewhat tied to a specific X-Men title, these titles both had X-Men in the name, and often stories unfolded and were woven through multiple series, meaning you needed to collect multiple titles to get the whole story. While this can be fun at the time of collecting, it can also be exhausting, and expensive, and confusing to figure out when you're returning back to older stories. Both teams actually lived in the X-Mansion, but simply went on separate missions. Starting in 1993 with Uncanny X-Men issue 298 and X-Men issue number 17, the teams also started to swap members for certain missions, making everything even more confusing for readers to try to discern between the two once very distinct rosters. During this era, however, we did get many memorable and character-defining stories, including Fatal Attractions, Phalanx Covenant, and the Onslaught event. But by 1994, the terms blue and gold had kinda lost all meaning, with both teams pretty much melding together. By 1998, the roster had shrunk down to 8 core members, including Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Gambit, and Marrow, surprisingly, with stories featuring the team continuing to weave back and forth between Uncanny X-Men and the X-Men series, starting with issue number 360 and issue number 80, respectively. Since the 90s, there have been a slew of other important stories as we moved into the 2000s and beyond, including the alternate timeline Ultimate X-Men, E is for Extinction, House of M and M-Day, Messiah Complex and Messiah War, Schism, Avengers vs. X-Men, Inhumans vs. X-Men, and Resurrection. There have also been countless X-Men books featuring multiple teams, many of which simply refer to themselves as the X-Men, even when a mainstay X-Men book was also already ongoing alongside them, which means we get a lot of stories, but also making sense of the X-Men roster gets more and more confusing. These titles have included The Amazing X-Men, The Astonishing X-Men, Extreme X-Men, New X-Men, which was the mainstay at the time, known as the Grant Morrison era of X-Men, X-Men Legacy, Young X-Men, Wolverine in the X-Men, which is actually one of my favorites, All New X-Men, which featured the time-displaced OG X-Men, X-Men Gold, Spider-Man in the X-Men, Extraordinary X-Men, the 2017 relaunch of Blue and Gold teams with X-Men Blue and X-Men Gold. And then of course, there were all the books that were simply known as Uncanny X-Men and X-Men, including one volume of the series simply titled X-Men from 2015 that features an all-female roster of mutants led by Storm that I feel like no one really ever talks about for some reason. I still can't believe how seemingly quiet the hype surrounding that series was, and I know that not a lot of people were super here for it, but also, what a cool team! I suppose it all pretty much goes to show you that by the 2010s, people were pretty much overwhelmed with X-Men content, with the mutant hype receding for some time. To give you some more perspective here, despite the initial X-Men series being consistently returned to, sometimes renamed, but often maintaining or returning to actual legacy numbering, we are still also on the 6th volume of the X-Men title with the 2021 series. Pretty crazy to think, considering how long some of those other series went on for. The modern age, however, has seen a great boost to X-Men popularity, and I have to say I feel lucky to be one of the folks reading along through this entire era. In 2019, Jonathan Hickman and Pepe Larraz became the main creative team behind House of X and Powers of 10, which kicked off the era of X-Men we are in now, which I like to refer to as the Krakoan era. This has been a 3-part multi-year saga that is still ongoing, spanning a number of series in the double digits. The 3 major acts of this epic can be divided between Dawn of X, Reign of X, and Fall of X. Events have included one of my all-time favorites, Ten of Swords, the Marvel-wide crossover AXE Judgment Day or Axe, and SOS, aka Sins of Sinister, as well as recurring yearly Hellfire galas, which we can all dress up and attend in our minds. However, the X-Men history and family will continue on as the Krakoa era is soon coming to a close, with 2023's Hellfire Gala being advertised as the last. My heart. Time to open up our time-traveling history comic books class. Explaining Kang is a daunting feat because, well, Kang is not just Kang. Kang is many different people through time. And through this wibbly-wobbly time-traveling journey, I will be your guide. Me, Amanda. Kang the Conqueror is often considered to be the prime Kang, while other versions of the character are either Kang from alternate timelines or perhaps divergent versions of the character who split off through time to follow another path and become known by a completely different name, which sounds like an alternate version but it's kind of a little different. I'll touch somewhat on these alternates while trying to keep us mostly focused on the main Kang, Kang the Conqueror. Often known for being an Avengers and Fantastic Four villain, Kang the Conqueror is a villain from the future, who often manipulates the timeline in order to bring his plots to fruition. Himself, being a genius, he is also the kind of villain that can sometimes act as an ally to heroes when a threat is too great for them to handle it alone. Oh, and he's also a man of many chairs. He has a time chair that he literally uses to time travel, and he also has this sweet, floating, invisible beanbag chair because he's from the future. I hope in the future we all get invisible beanbag chairs, and guess what? We do, because this video is brought to you by Float, the new invisible beanbag chair. No, I'm just kidding. I wish though. If you invent an invisible beanbag chair, please sponsor us because I want one of those. Kang the Conqueror is kind of a weird villain with a very unique look, which I think is why so many are surprised to see him coming to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and were surprised when he was revealed to be, you know, kind of a villain that we'd be seeing. Initially, I was one of the people that also thought this was an unusual pick for a villain, especially with him appearing as the seeming main antagonist in the Ant-Man and the Wasp film Quantumania. But then I thought about it, and I realized just how serious of a threat Kang could be if he weren't reduced to simply being one iteration of the character. Kang is not just a universal threat like Thanos was after all, he is a potential multiversal threat. Fighting Kang is like fighting a one-man time-traveling army that is always multiple steps ahead of you, and also an army that seems to fight within itself and only creates more problems by doing that. And also a villain where anyone, even your closest allies, could secretly be manipulated by, or perhaps even just straight up be, a Kang variant. Now, as soon as I realized that the multiverse was what we were building towards in the next phase, Kang's presence made a lot more sense to me. Multiverse of Madness, What If, Loki, and even to a certain extent I would say WandaVision all seem to be pushing towards this idea of expanding the MCU beyond just the home universe. I mean, even Ms. Marvel kind of gets in on that idea with her being able to access another dimension, or at least, you know, we kind of allude to that, we see that a little bit in that series. With Shang-Chi and the 10 Rings, I thought we might be going cosmic when we kind of got that tease where we're talking about where are the rings from, and now I think we're likely going beyond that to other dimensions. I wouldn't be surprised if the 10 Rings were like, I don't know, based in quantum something or doing some other universal stuff that came from another world entirely. Kang the Conqueror first appeared as a foe to the Avengers in issue number 8 of their first series. He was created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, and boy is he a true Jack Kirby creation if ever I have seen one. He's a lot of a lot, and also, I mean, that character design. Super Jack Kirby in the best of ways. While Kang was seemingly instantly defeated by having a radiation attack bounced back at him, forcing him to flee on his spaceship despite having somewhat of a natural immunity to radiation thanks to being from the future. This wouldn't nearly be the last we'd see of him, and I would say he almost instantly made his mark as an iconic character in that issue. Man, in the future, what do we have to look forward to? Invisible beanbag chairs and apparently some level of radiation immunity. Sounds pretty cool to me if that's our future. Kang the Conqueror is said to hail from the 30th century, believed to be the future or a version of the future of Earth 616. Kang's home reality, however, is known as Earth 6311, sometimes also referred to as Other Earth. Other Earth is a little bit different from the main reality in that there were no dark ages on this world, so that's also why we don't just call it, you know, the future of 616, and honestly, even if we did, we'd probably still give it another number because we never want to be too specific in the comics with what the future really holds. Instead, this alternate Earth skipped the era known as the Dark Ages. Thanks to rapid advancement, they would end up with a colony on the moon, known as Luna, but unfortunately would succumb to war when both the Earth and the moon colony clashed with one another. As a result, the moon would be destroyed entirely, completely obliterated, and its pieces would rain down on Earth, causing massive destruction and leaving the people of planet Earth largely scattered and isolated. Other Earth would also be a world that Reed Richards' father, Nathaniel Richards of Earth 616, would travel to, unite together, and ultimately lead alongside his wife, Cassandra, who hailed herself from Earth 6311, helping Other Earth to recover from a devastating war. Cassandra herself, I believe, is a princess in that future. So, you know, that happens and then you can rule together. However, Cassandra would eventually come to covet the power she held and become known as the villain Warlord, unbeknownst to her husband. But eventually the Fantastic Four would travel to Other Earth and help to defeat Warlord. Years later, Cassandra and Nathaniel's children would rule, truly ushering in an era of peace. It was during this time that Nathaniel Richards was born. No, not Reed Richards' father, Nathaniel. His possible future descendant, Nathaniel Richards. Are you confused yet? Although some signs actually point to this Nathaniel, who would become Kang, as a true descendant of Victor Von Doom instead, aka Dr. Doom, the Fantastic Four villain. And others still seem to reconcile both of these records, implying that Nathaniel Richards of Earth 6311 was actually descended from both Reed and Victor, somehow. When I say that, I always imagine like a ship of Reed and Victor together and they're like in love, and then somehow Nathaniel's descended from that, but that's not exactly what we mean here, I don't think. When Nathaniel was just a teenager, one of his first other personas entered the chat. This was the person many of us got excited about as potentially existing in the MCU. Iron Lad. Iron Lad is a member of the Young Avengers, acting as the team's version of Iron Man. When Iron Man ends up getting help from a kid named Harley Keener in Iron Man 3, many people believed this could actually be a version of Iron Lad and we could see Iron Lad in the MCU. And now, with Kang being introduced into the MCU in Quantumania, many believe we could yet see a more comic book adaptation of Iron Lad via Jonathan Majors. Perhaps another alternate version of Kang, where instead Kang becomes the hero known as Iron Lad. This current theory comes from the comics, where Iron Lad, member of the Young Avengers, is later revealed to be a teenage version of Nathaniel Richards of Earth 6311, aka a past version of Kang, before he obviously became Kang. Iron Lad comes to Earth 616 to hide, and hopefully seek help from the Avengers to protect him from his future self, refusing to grow up and become Kang. He's basically looking for a way to avoid that. In fact, Kang the Conqueror would even end up having a comic series with his younger self, Iron Lad, in 2021, titled Kang the Conqueror. Now this 5-issue mini would be all about Kang basically trying to teach his younger self and young Nathaniel wrestling with his own fate and destiny. Kang was basically trying to get him to accept him becoming Kang and like teach him how to be like the best Kang he can be. This wouldn't be the only version of young Kang that we'd come to know though. In addition to Iron Lad, there is also Kid Immortus, I believe in comic book history, who came into existence following Nathaniel's time as Iron Lad. While Iron Lad made his first appearance in the mid-noughts in Young Avengers issue number 1, Kid Immortus made his first appearance back in 2013 in FF issue number 8, the second FF volume. Not to be confused with the second Fantastic Four volume, which is a different title. So when I'm saying FF, I literally mean the letters FF. And I know that's confusing because FF is often used as a short form when we're talking about the Fantastic Four. But this time around, well, it is also being used in that context in terms of, you know, what the book is about. It's also literally just FF if you're looking to follow up on that series and you're trying to Google it. Even when we aren't directly talking about time travel stuff in Kang's history, it can be confusing to follow. So hopefully you're following along with me here. Let me get my chart. Are you following along all this weirdness? Despite these adventures through time and the attempts young Nathaniel made to avoid ever becoming Kang, he would end up doing just that, becoming Kang. This part of the story, however, hasn't really been documented yet and is a bit of a gap in his history. What we do know is that Kang and other versions of him across time do exist, implying that even after his time as Kid Immortus and Iron Lad, Nathaniel Richards returned to his own timeline and eventually would decide to time travel, although it's unclear if his memories of being either of these younger personas remains with him or not. Eventually, Nathaniel would turn to time travel as a way to apparently alleviate boredom, coming to the ancient past and settling down in Egypt, where he would be known by another name, Ramatut. Nathaniel would indeed become Pharaoh Ramatut, living as a ruler in Egypt until the time-traveling Fantastic Four showed up and stopped him. Because, you know, that's what they do. Following this, Ramatut attempted to return back to his own timeline from there, but he got caught in a time storm along the way, as I guess is warrant to happen when you are time traveling. Admittedly, you know, I don't recall hearing of many other time storms in the history of Marvel Comics, but they must happen, and you know, maybe they're just a little bit more rare. We only hear of them every now and then. I think Wolverine did end up in a time storm once with Puck when they traveled kind of through a picture back to a war-torn 1930s Spain, but you know, other than Kang, I think that's about all I can think of. Let me know in the comments all the time storms you can think of. Oh wait, I actually think my insult of time storms has caused one to head our way. Oh no, hurry, click the like button to save me from being displaced through time. Help! Whew, okay, thanks to those of you who clicked like, that was a close one. And to all of you who did not click like, I want you to know that my life flashed before my eyes. Caught in the time storm, Ramatut ended up displaced in modern day Earth 616. There he met his possible ancestor Dr. Doom and was inspired to give up his Ramatut persona to become more like Doom. Which honestly, fair enough. If I met Dr. Doom, I'd also probably be like, you seem cool, I'm gonna do what you're doing. This was how Nathaniel would go on to become Scarlet Centurion. It was also later revealed that the time storm he was caught in was actually all done by Immortus, yet another time-divergent version of Kang. Apparently, Immortus created time storms to prevent Kang from creating certain alternate reality selves and to stop him from, I guess, you know, like tampering too much with the timeline. Often in comics, Kang's most dangerous enemy tends to be like another version of Kang, and Immortus and Kang have definitely both acted against one another throughout their histories. Scarlet Centurion didn't quite work out for Kang as an identity. He ended up encountering the Avengers in the Avengers 1968 annual, and this would be similar to how his first ever comics appearance would go, in the sense that he would end up being pretty handily defeated here. This prompted him to abandon the Scarlet Centurion look and name and return once more to being Ramatut, which, after all, I suppose had been much more successful in comparison, so that makes sense to me. As Ramatut, Nathaniel would once more attempt to return home to the future of the 30th century, but alas, more time storms. Ramatut goes to check the weather. Dang time storms, time storms, time storms, jeez! All weather channels are forecasting time storms all this week. How am I supposed to travel through time in this terrible weather? This is awful. Also, this weatherman, Immortus, you know, he sure looks familiar to me. Oh well, whoever he is, he certainly is a handsome devil, I'll say that. Once more being tossed up in another time storm, Ramatut instead missed his stop in the 30th century, instead being catapulted even further into the future, into the 40th century. There, he discovered primitive beings fighting with sort of past technological weapons they no longer seem to fully understand. At this point, Ramatut fancied himself a, you know, sort of a master of past tech and weapons and figured, you know, screw it, I could just rule these people. I have the knowledge to do it, so why wouldn't I? And so Nathaniel reinvented himself once more as Kang the Conqueror. Finally, we're there! He succeeded in conquering this far-flung future, not just the planet, but beyond, building his own galactic empire. However, Kang still found himself thinking back to the past and the modern era of Earth 616. Not fully satisfied with what he had accomplished here in the future, he set out to become the ruler of Earth 616 as well. It's also believed that his ambition to rule the time period of Earth 616 was also tied to the fact that he'd heard a tale of a celestial Madonna, who would become the mother of the most powerful man in all of known history. Basically, Kang wanted to become the baby daddy of that most powerful figure, which is kind of a weird thought when, like me, you know that the celestial Madonna turned out to be the hero Mantis, and that her baby would grow up to be the half-human, half-Kotati Sequoia, aka Koya, who recently was one of the main villains of the Empire event a few years back. I wonder if there's a future where instead of the Kotati resurrected version of Swordsman being that baby's dad, Kang is his dad instead?
As many villains in the Marvel universe tend to be shared amongst heroes, unlike DC comic villains who tend to mostly only go up against their designated hero, it can be difficult to untangle the shared and convoluted history of some of the more dangerous Marvel rogues. Welcome to Top 10 Nerd. I'm Andrew Boyd, and with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 being the next Marvel movie coming to theaters, we figured now would be a good time to go into the history of its villain. Today, I will be attempting to explain the High Evolutionary. He is a complicated character, so today we will just be focusing on his early life and what caused him to descend into villainy, not the specifics of his various evil plots, which we could potentially get into in a part 2. With that out of the way, let's get started with his origins. The High Evolutionary made his first appearance in 1966's Thor, number 134, but we didn't learn the finer details of his origin until the Evolutionary War event segment, which started in 1988's X Factor Annual number 3 and was told in backup stories across the annuals of several different Marvel comics that year, including Punisher, Web of Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Avengers, X-Men, and more. The High Evolutionary was originally a British scientist named Herbert Edgar Wyndham, who, inspired by the work of Nathaniel Essex, aka Mr. Sinister, was trying to crack the code of evolution by using a machine that he'd built in his mother's basement to force rats to evolve. But though he could alter the DNA, all of his test subjects died in the experiments. He was invited to attend the 1923 International Conference on Genetics in Geneva, Switzerland, where he met an American scientist about his age named Jonathan Drew, who was studying arthropodic zoology at Yale. They became friends, but the conference was a disappointment for Herbert, as the keynote speaker advised him that his attempts to accelerate genetic material would be disastrous if he attempted it before scientists successfully managed to map the genetic code. Herbert and Jonathan got drunk together to drown their sorrows, but while Herbert was stumbling through an alley, he was approached by a mysterious figure, who we would later learn was actually the Inhuman known as Fedar in disguise. Fedar gave Herbert a package of papers which contained a blueprint for breaking the genetic code so that he could continue his research. Herbert built his machine while studying at Oxford, but was so focused on his research that he failed his classes and was expelled. He moved back into his mother's house and performed his first successful experiment, transforming his pet Dalmatian into a dog man. The creature escaped, and confused hunters shot it, causing Herbert to realize that he needed to find a place to continue his work where, quote, his subjects will be free from unthinking bumblers. He got in contact with Jonathan Drew, who had just inherited some land in the Balkans. They partnered up, and Herbert, Jonathan, his wife Miriam, and their daughter Jessica Drew set out to Wundagore Mountain. Life on Wundagore. While conducting their research, the two scientists discovered that the mountain was rich with uranium, which they began mining to finance their work, and the designing of an advanced lab that could fly away to space if need be. Fedar showed up again and gave Herbert a tribe of the underground creatures known as the Moloids, who would mine the uranium as well as construct the lab for Herbert. Things seemed to be going well until Jessica became sick with radiation sickness, because the two scientists apparently never thought that raising a child next to a uranium mine might be a bad idea. Herbert placed Jessica in cryostasis to slow the radiation's progression, while her father injected her with the spider extract serum that he had been working on, thinking it would allow her body to adapt to the radiation for reasons I'm not entirely clear on. Unfortunately, the serum needed time to metabolize, and Jessica Drew was left in stasis, Nora Freeze style. Her mother became distraught and left, but was mauled by a werewolf and killed. Jonathan left the lab in his grief, and Herbert set about finding the werewolf, constructing a suit of armor that could protect him from injury. He found the werewolf in his lab feeding on the Moloids and captured the wolf. Having completed the construction job, the Moloids disappeared back underground, never to be seen by Herbert again. The High Evolutionary began using his genetic accelerator to evolve animals into animal men. He would then submit them to educational programming in order to raise their intelligence. The werewolf was actually his neighbor, Baron Gregor Rusoff, who the High Evolutionary would confine on nights with a full moon in exchange for being allowed to study the Baron when he was in wolf form. Jonathan Drew showed up again, but claimed to actually be a dead mage named Magnus, who had taken the mystical Darkhold from the evil Morgan Le Fay and had been killed, but was now controlling Herbert's old partner. He warned Herbert that an evil demon named Chthon was coming to Wundagore Mountain. Herbert, being a scientist who didn't believe in magic, despite the werewolf in his basement, thought his old partner had simply lost his mind. Despite not believing Magnus, Herbert followed his advice and trained his new men to have the same moral code as the knights of old in order to help them overcome their beastly natures, and they became the Knights of Wundagore. Around this time, Magneto's runaway and pregnant wife Magda stumbled across the High Evolutionary's lab while in labor. A cow nurse named Bova was instructed to help Magda through her labor, while at the same time the demon Chthon attacked the knights. Several of them died in the effort, but the ghost of Magnus managed to defeat the demon, but not before it managed to touch the newly born Wanda Maximoff, who would grow up to be the Scarlet Witch. Magda feared that if Magneto found her, he would take the children and make them into monsters, so she walked off into the mountains, aliens, never to be seen again, and the High Evolutionary gave Wanda and her twin brother Pietro up for adoption to a nearby Romani tribe. Although, it should be noted that in the years since this story, it has been heavily retconned so that Wanda and Pietro are not Magneto and Magda's kids and were kidnapped from their real parents by the High Evolutionary to be experimented on, resulting in their powers. So this part isn't canon, I guess, and it also kind of makes the High Evolutionary much more villainous much earlier. So we're gonna keep going with the old version. Leaving Earth. The next part of the High Evolutionary's story comes from his first appearance in Thor number 134 and 135. In this story, Thor is looking for a missing Jane Foster, who has been transported to a random location by an alien Conqueror in an effort to distract the God of Thunder. Thor tracks Jane to Wundagore and is attacked by the Knights, who bring him to the Evolutionary so he can decide what to do with him. Herbert is evolving a wolf, but leaves the lab to see what the deal is with the guy with the hammer. Thor demands Jane's return, and High Evolutionary is like, yeah, she just showed up one day and we've been sheltering her. Take her, I do not care. Unfortunately, Herbert forgot to turn off his machine, so the wolf evolved past the point they were aiming for and became the dreaded man-beast, a creature obsessed with destroying Herbert and any other life that he comes across. Thor helps the Knights and Herbert defeat Man-Beast and the army of highly evolved creatures he creates, and Evolutionary sends them to a distant galaxy where they can start their own society, before taking off with his lab and Knights for space where he can continue his work in safety. He leaves Bova behind with Jessica, who would later grow up to be Spider-Woman thanks to all that spider serum her dad pumped into her. The rocket ended up on an abandoned alien city, and Herbert created a bunch of animal wives for his Knights and focuses on his work. While working, he discovers that the Knights reverted to savagery and need to be stopped, so he has the Hulk brought to him to help defeat the Knights. They succeed, but Herbert is fatally wounded in the process and has no choice but to put himself through 1,000,000 years of evolution to try and survive. He becomes a dumb-looking, floating and glowing form who can see all that ever was or could be, and devolves his Knights and sends the Hulk home before taking off to see the universe. After putzing about the universe for a while, Herbert manages to reverse the evolution process so that he is only 100,000 years more evolved than most humans, and decides to create his own Earth to study, creating Counter-Earth. Man-Beast showed up again and taught the people of Counter-Earth violence, ruining the experiment. It was at this moment that Adam Warlock emerged from his cocoon, which Herbert had come into possession of, and volunteered to stop Man-Beast from ruining Counter-Earth. High Evolutionary agreed and gave Adam the Soul Gem to aid him in his quest. High Evolutionary then became a protector for the world he had created, fighting Galactus when he tried to devour Counterworld, and when Counterworld was stolen by the prime movers of Tarkus, Adam Warlock thought that the High Evolutionary had destroyed the planet and tried to kill Herbert with the Soul Gem. The trauma of this caused Herbert not to die, but to take on his godlike evolved form once more, becoming a villain. The High Evolutionary soon returned to his physical form and decided to find out what had happened to Counter-Earth. He learned that the Beyonders had taken Counter-Earth to be a part of a cosmic museum, and realizing how powerless he was in the face of such power, and not being able to deal with the fact that his life's work was being put on display by cosmic beings, like a child's crayon drawing being put on a fridge, he decided to end his own life. However, his battle armor prevented all of his attempts, so he decided to pick a fight with the Hulk so that he could break the armor open and he could die. Free of his armor, the High Evolutionary devolved himself into a pile of goo, but his armor soon returned him to life, but the process did cure him of his depression, and he decided that he would help mankind achieve its highest potential, saying, "My encounter with the Beyonders has demonstrated to me that mankind's genetic destiny is not glorious enough. Left to our own natural path, we will never be the equal to the Beyonders. Thus, someone must guide the path of man's evolution and provide a catalyst to further our race's genetic potential. This someone, of course, must be me. I hereby assume proprietorship of man's racial destiny. Under my guidance, the human race will evolve further than the Beyonders, further than any other race of beings in existence, no matter what it takes. I shall not stop until man reigns supreme in all the universe." It was at this point that the High Evolutionary Evolutionary became a villain, using violent methods to attack groups who he determined were evolutionary dead ends.
Happy holidays!
Welcome to Top 10 Nerd. Well, it's that magical time of year where Marvel and DC fans can come together and argue over who is the superior publisher while wearing truly heinous looking sweaters.
But one thing I think we can agree on is that Santa, that guy slays.
While Saint Nick has shown up in both Marvel and DC, his appearances in Marvel are just a little bit more astounding and kind of confusing.
So, we're gonna talk about it.
This year, as a special stocking stuffer for the best group of viewers on the whole internet, we will be attempting to explain Marvel Comics' Santa Claus.
Oh boy. Where does Santa come from? The age-old question so many of us have been wondering what the answer to is for years. I'm still wondering, but don't worry, children and adults of all kinds, I'm gonna tell you the answer. At least I will tell you in regards to what we know of Santa from his origin over at Marvel Comics. For the real Santa, I can't really say. I'm sworn to secrecy. Santa gets his existence and power from humanity's belief in him though at Marvel Comics. Kinda like the gods from the Distinguished Competition, aka DC Comics, or at least the gods from DC's Vertigo imprint. The gods showcased in Neil Gaiman's The Sandman seem to get their power from humanity's belief and need for them. So as some gods become less influential and important in humanity's day-to-day life, they also become less powerful, basically shadows of their former selves. With Santa, there are 3 people he is often mistaken for, and whose origins people often mistakenly attribute to him. Though if Santa was brought to life by kind of like all 3 of these legendary figures, then I suppose in a way it's not a mistake because all of their origins kind of are his origins. Anyways, who are these 3 legends, you ask? Well, one story suggests that Santa Claus is possibly actually none other than, or at least inspired by, the story of Odin's generosity one midwinter night. That's right, we are talking about Odin, the Allfather of Asgard. Some people think of Santa as Odin. Oh boy. This story takes place on a night where a village's midwinter's feast was under threat, while at the same time, so was the existence of Asgard. Asgard had been threatened by Grylak the Greater, a troll who threatened to destroy the realm of Asgard with an asteroid if he was not given control of it by the Allfather. You know Odin is not gonna just do that, but anyways. At the same time on Earth, Sigurd and his crew were returning home to the feast when their boat was caught in a really bad storm. Sia, Sigurd's wife, prayed for the safety of her husband and his crew to Odin. Odin, being the wise god he is, and the super nice god he is, at least in Marvel Comics, decided to solve both problems simultaneously. He had Thor gather materials for the feast from Asgard, find linens, food, and wine, then he had Thor use Mjolnir to obliterate the asteroid. The flash of light from the destructive explosion helped Sigurd and his crew sail on safely home. Odin brought the resources gathered to Sia as gifts, disappearing on a sleigh afterwards pulled by flying rams before Sigurd returned, calling out, "A good midwinter to all, and to all a good life." Another theory suggests that Santa is actually the spirit of the winter season, or at least once was. This idea is inspired by an alleged custom from pre-medieval Britain. The custom involved elders of communities dressing up in furs and being referred to as Old Winter while traveling from home to home. The thought here was that those who showed kindness to Old Winter would also be showed kindness by the winter season. Respect and kindness equals respect and kindness. I like it, makes sense. Following the rise of Christianity, the central character of the custom was changed somewhat from Old Winter to Old Christmas, and then to Old Father Christmas, before finally becoming simply known as Father Christmas. Finally, one of the other common stories, possibly the most common story in modern times, is that of Saint Nicholas. Saint Nicholas was a man from the area near what we now know as Turkey, hailing from the 4th century where he became the Bishop of Myra. Nicholas was known for his kind heart, his giving nature, his love of children, and for making miracles happen. Ooh, miracles. Many stories were told about him, but the most famous one involves him helping a family to pay for their daughter's dowries by sneaking gold into their house. I don't know why you wouldn't just give them the gold, but hey. After a few attempts, he succeeded in this one night when he had managed to get a bag of gold down the family's chimney. The gold supposedly appeared the morning after in stockings that had been been left out to dry over the fireplace. Ooh, Christmassy. Nicholas did not brag about his good deeds and himself was pretty humble, but eventually word of his charity and the miracles he seemingly caused spread, causing him to become celebrated by people even outside of Mira. People often made a habit of attributing unexpected gifts and mysterious acts of charity to him. Following his death, a church was built in his honor. Tales of St. Nicholas would eventually make their way to the ears of Russian royalty, who decided to make St. Nicholas the patron saint of Russia. Tales also spread to the Netherlands, where he was initially known as Sint Nicholas, then Sinterklaas, which would go on to inspire the name Santa Claus. Get it? December 5th became a day of giving in his honor, being the day before he died. However, this tradition would then be combined with the story of the birth of Jesus, with December 25th becoming the day that we celebrate instead, now known as Christmas. Santa, however, is kind of like a combination of all these figures, but also is his own thing. When humanity's belief combined with the three legends and spiritual energy, we got a recipe for one Santa Claus, please. Santa is believed to be a physical manifestation of generosity, something that all three legends share in theme. But he also might be a mutant. More on that later. After coming into being, Santa set up his home base in Finland, initially in a city known as Korventunturi. He would ride around on horseback delivering presents on Christmas morning. Later, he'd upgrade his operation after he met and married Mrs. Claus. They would move to the North Pole and create a workshop there before expanding his empire further by employing a workforce of elves, mainly made up of the light elves of Elfheim, to help them in creating gifts and toys. In regards to Santa's first appearance in Marvel Comics, it's super weird, but that's kind of what I love about it, so here we go. Santa's first appearance happened in November of 1955 in Strange Tales issue number 34, where he appeared as a magical, jolly fellow who also has a really sweet red car. Now that's my kind of Santa. The story begins at a garage and service station where we are introduced to Sammy Glenn, who works as a station attendant. Sammy is apparently both a genius and a man with a big generous heart, but simply with the worst luck in all of his life. After all, how else did he end up working here? Could it be a lack of ambition, or I don't know, simply due to his low self-esteem? Definitely not. It's just something that happened to poor Sammy and that he has zero control over, I'm sure. Sammy spends some time feeling bad for himself, inner monologue style, before getting shamed by an old friend, Ben Graham, who stops by to get gas, with Ben taking every opportunity to rag on Sammy for being too nice. Because apparently the theme of Sammy's life is nice guys finish last while jerks only ever succeed, I guess. The next day at work, a mysterious man arrives. He ends up presumably getting a top up on gas and a car tune-up because he decides to leave his car there for 6 hours. That's gotta be some kind of tune-up, that's a long time. The man asks Sammy to watch his things closely because he refuses to lock up anything and secure his own valuables. So that's on Sammy. Even though Sammy is tipped well and presumably the car is there to have something done to it for 6 hours, Sammy decides to dress up in the man's clothes and takes his car for a joyride to give himself a taste of the high life. He drives back home to rub his pretend success in everybody's face. Yep, what a nice guy he is. I'll parade my success in front of their bulging eyes. Wes Morrow, the banker, Madge Grammer, the girl who turned me down, Jim Leverett, the lawyer. I'll look up Jim first. So it turns out Jim's dead. Madge looks like she's about to die after having 4 kids and apparently a failure of a husband, and Wes is now homeless. Disappointed in how everyone that came out of his hometown, including himself, turned out to be a failure, Sammy heads to an exclusive executive club for a drink before returning the car, and is surprised that he actually succeeds to get in. Another theme in this weird holiday story: fake it till you make it. Sammy meets a woman who mistakes him for another club member and asks him what he does. When he tells her that he's in between jobs but is hoping to get a job in engineering research, she decides to just give him her number. Super realistic, I think. A man overhears Sammy is looking for work in engineering and straight up offers him a job in the field, because the man thinks Sammy is a bona fide club member. I can't believe it! I'm Sammy Glenn, the guy who never had a break in his life! Suddenly, a beautiful woman falls for me, the president of a big corporation offers me a top job. From nobody, suddenly I'm somebody. I have money, success. Why? Because Santa, that's why. The final panels reveal that the garage calendar shows today as Christmas. And who is the mystery man who left his car, suit, and belongings unsecured? Why, Santa, of course. Apparently, if you pity yourself enough and temporarily steal Santa's belongings for an afternoon, you too can have it all, thanks to the miracle of Christmas. This is where I'd have glitter and I'd throw it. Hold up! As a gift to us, why not like this video and subscribe for more Top 10 Nerd? Seriously, the miracle of Christmas, you gotta do it, okay? Bye.
Now we're gonna move on to Santa Claus's major appearances. A lot of Santa's appearances have been in passing, like in the Strange Tales of the Unusual short story where a Scrooge-like man has a change of heart during Christmas and Santa just waltzes on by and at the end of the story and says, "Good job." Now, because that's rather boring, I'm going to talk about some of his more interesting appearances after his first really weird one. Starting with his notable appearances in Howard the Duck Volume 2 Issue 3, with a release date of December 4th, 1979 and a cover date of February 1980. Because the world is constantly changing and we as humans as a species are constantly advancing and growing, and because Santa is hella old, he decides to try and modernize to fit in. He cuts down his beard to be more slick, he rebuilds his sleigh to be self-propelled using Roxxon Oil's high-octane fuel instead of subjecting his reindeer to the emotional and physical stress of doing the job, and he also opened up a nuclear power plant and a gas station up in the North Pole. Unfortunately, one of the villainous workers at the plant, named Greedy Killerwatt, decided he was going to take over Christmas as revenge against society for a mutation that made him look like a light bulb. He convinced a convict named Pinball Lizard, who Santa had hired for his fun and games department, to try and bring Santa down by not putting enough gas in his sleigh so that the big man would crash. And in his absence, they would take over the toy workshop, forcing the elves to make mass-produced toys that just straight up suck. Luckily though, when Santa's sleigh crashed, the crash happened in Cleveland, where Santa ran into Howard the Duck. They, Howard and Santa, return to the North Pole, where a battle breaks out between Santa, Howard, and the loyal forces of North Pole against the mutated villains and their mutated animal minions. But that wasn't his only Howard the Duck story. In Howard the Duck Holiday Special Volume 1, Issue 1 from 1996, we got a story called Wreck the Malls with Hydra's Folly, where the old jolly guy becomes just upset with humanity's lack of faith and belief, so he sells the entire gift-making and giving Christmas enterprise to Hydra. This time, Howard the Duck was working as a mall Santa, and he gets recruited by an elf alongside a bunch of other mall Santas to save Christmas. Now his next big appearance, and probably one of Santa's most notable ones, was in Marvel Holiday Special Volume 1, released on November 19th, 1991, with a cover date of December 1991. In a little story called A Miracle a Few Blocks Down from 34th Street, 'twas the day before Christmas, and all through the Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, Cerebro detected what it called the most powerful mutant ever registered, who had just miraculously appeared in New York's Rockefeller Center. The X-Men obviously went off to investigate, but this massively powerful mutant was also detected by a group of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who also went to try and capture the mutant for their own evil purposes, resulting in a clash between the two factions. But this mutant just happened to be Santa Claus himself, who used his insane power to briefly transform the Brotherhood into toys. He teleported the X-Men away, erased everyone's memory, and then made it snow, giving New York the first white Christmas in a hot minute. Next up, in Sensational She-Hulk Volume 1, number 8, and also number 36, released August 1st, 1989 and December 3rd, 1991, respectively. At this time in his life, Santa Claus had decided that, with his ability to know who was naughty and nice, he would make an absolutely show-stealing detective. So that's what he does, becoming Nick St. Christopher. And together with She-Hulk, they take on the investigation of a killer. He even gets the hots for old Jennifer Walters, which gets Mrs. Claus a little bit jealous. By the end of the story, he gives Jen a gift that allows her to temporarily transform into her human form so she can have a normal Christmas with her family. So nice. Now for the next Santa story, we can look to Marvel Age Volume 1, number 109 from February of 1992. This story, told by Captain America to some kids, takes us back in time to December 1943, when the leader of the German Axis forces during World War II, who will remain nameless, captured Santa Claus to try and destroy the morale of the USA. But President Franklin Roosevelt sent the heroes Nick Fury, Captain America, and James Bucky Barnes to rescue old Saint Nick. There was also Marvel Holiday Spectacular magazine from 2009, which contained the story from a continuity that never existed. Santa Claus versus the Illuminati. Here, Iron Man calls together the Illuminati because it turns out that all of Santa's reindeer were actually Skrulls. With no way to make his Christmas deliveries the traditional way, the Illuminati instead give Claus the Infinity Gems and Infinity Gauntlet, which actually corrupted the Saint. Luckily, Namor got him with a snowball to the schnauzer that knocked him over and caused the gauntlet to fall off. Instead of giving Santa the assembled Infinity Gauntlet, Iron Man just makes Santa some robotic reindeer. Why he didn't do that in the first place? I don't know, I just work here. Last but not least, by any stretch of the imagination, we have got to talk about Deadpool Volume 7, Issue number 7, released in December of 2018. Discovering that on Christmas Day no one had delivered their presents, a group of enraged children, who seem to be between the age of 5 and 9, find Deadpool's hideout and hire the mercenary with money from a Go Pay Me campaign to take out the big Claus himself for failing them. You see, Santa has been doing his thing for a long time, but that doesn't make him any good at running a business. Instead, one of his elves named Tinsel took the lead in organizing all of the operations of the North Pole. But Tinsel wanted to bring in outside help to cut the cost of their operation, and Santa ain't no sellout, except for that one time with Hydra. So he refuses. Tinsel, being the little troublemaker that he is, went around and convinced all the other elves that Santa was oppressing them, and he convinced them to all do a little walkout. Santa didn't take this too well and let himself go and became a massive manic mess. But like all of these stories, you'll have to read it yourself for all the fun little details because we're moving on. But before we do that, just some honorable mentions. Absolutely check out Power Man and Iron Fist's Sweet Christmas Annual from 2016 to see Santa take on Krampus himself, and King in Black Iron Man / Doom number 1 from 2021 to see those two directly take on Santa and question their own beliefs. Now, we're actually moving on.
Powers and abilities. Marvel's Santa has a wide variety of powers and abilities, but the source of his powers seems to be a bit inconsistent. In the Marvel Holiday Special of 1991, which Adam already talked about, where Cerebro informs them that it has located the most powerful mutant on Earth, this implies that the powers he uses in his appearances are manifestations of his mutation, such as when he turns the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants into action figures and then teleports the X-Men away from him with a touch of his nose, wiping their minds of the interaction in the process. However, in a breakdown of the character featured in Marvel Holiday Spectacular 2009, where they talk about his powers, he is said to be using magic to accomplish his feats, and they never bring up the fact that he's a mutant, let alone the most powerful one on Earth. There is some contention as to whether the ability to use magic is a mutant power or a separate thing, but whatever the source of his abilities, they are undeniably amazing. They are for the most part similar to the powers attributed to most other versions of the character, but with that slight Marvel weirdness. He is immortal, having looked like an old man for centuries, and seems to have reality-altering powers, being able to turn people into toys as mentioned before. Although his flying reindeer were apparently a gift from Odin, he can also magically empower animals, such as when he made a group of huskies capable of flight when his reindeer were rendered unavailable. Lending further credence to the magic theory, his strength is doubled on Christmas Eve, making him capable of lifting up to 2 tons. He also accomplishes many of his feats with the help of magical artifacts. For example, his sack is really a tesseract that creates a portal to another dimension that he uses to store the various gifts he needs to deliver. Although he is usually drawn as a white guy, he is actually using a psychic mirroring ability that will make him appear as the same race as whoever is looking at him. Speaking of psychic powers, he of course is able to determine who is naughty and who is nice, which he also uses to be the world's greatest detective, like when he teamed up with She-Hulk in Sensational She-Hulk number 8. Perhaps his most impressive feat of magic was in the Gwenpool Holiday Special, when he removed himself from Christmas to take a year off and made everyone on Earth forget him, and made it so that it was Galactus who gave gifts to the well-behaved children. Although this did cause a side effect of other holidays being affected, such as when Thanksgiving became Pantsgiving, where everyone gives each other tight hot pants. He prefers not to use his powers for combat, but that doesn't mean he is a slouch in that department. In his appearance in Deadpool Volume 7 number 7, he and Deadpool enter an intense brawl, and though he is ultimately no match for Deadpool, he does hold his own in the fight. Despite his incredible powers, he is often depicted being kidnapped by supervillains in his appearances and needing to be rescued by the heroes. It's frankly kind of bizarre that he can apparently rewrite reality to make Galactus the bringer of gifts, but can't escape from a comically oversized bear trap on Dr. Doom's roof without help.